Book 6, Flight of the Wounded Falcon, Chapter 9. That's one nasty stick. The area near the top of the peak was a favorite camping spot. Not only did it afford an impressive view of the surrounding peaks and valleys, it was relatively flat, had soft sandy patches that were ideal for sleeping on, and was surrounded by pine trees with the densest and most spherical pine cones in the area. Perfect for war. Perrin had forgotten about that as they approached the end of their hiking for the afternoon, too lost in thought to consider an ambush. But the first sharp cone that hit him in the shoulder immediately reminded him where he was and what he'd just walked into. Attack! Perrin barely had time to shield his face and dive behind a bush as the barrage of pine cones beat upon his body. Fortunately, he wasn't the main target. Most of the boys were aiming for young Pear. They remembered how 2 years ago he'd run ahead on the lower middle trail, collected a bag full of pine cones, climbed up a tree, and pelted each one of them as they ran for cover underneath him. The tree had gotten its revenge, however. That was the second time young Pear slipped and impaled himself on a branch. The year before, on the Idamean Trail, 3 lumberjacks had to cut down a tree to rescue young Pear when a branch punctured his thigh and refused to let go. The stick that stabbed young Pear 2 years ago had only entered into his bicep, and Peto was confident they didn't need to recruit assistants to cut his son free this time. Peto had climbed a nearby tree and hacked off the offending branch with his axe to free young Pear, while Bosco Zenas waited below, his new doctor's bag open and ready. So today, Perrin was suffering because of young Pear's previous pinecone attack, but not nearly as much as his grandson. Perrin took cover under a wide, thick shrub and scrabbled along the ground to a small opening in the foliage, where a few stray pine cones fell. He pocketed those, then watched from the concealing safety of the branches and laughed quietly at the scene. Young Pear frantically searched for shelter from the bombardment of more than 20 men and boys pelting him with pine cones, dodging this way and that and always into a new assault. It wasn't as if they could help it, Perrin decided long ago. Nearly every young man there had an ancestor who had been a soldier. Although Salem was a peaceful land, it was in the boys' blood to engage in warfare at least occasionally. Plotting, fighting, shouting, pursuing, they just had to get it out of their systems sometimes. Still flailing to defend himself from the attack, young Pear ran over to his cousin Lek, snatched Fennec from his arms, and held him up in front of him like a shield. "Oh, unfair!" Lek cried. "Holding a child hostage, that's really low, young Pear." "Drop them!" young Pear yelled, displaying his young cousin who was clutching a pinecone. "Drop them all, or you have to take Fennec to use the tree." No one threw another cone, worried about hitting the little boy. But Fennec wasn't defenseless. With his pinecone in his chubby fist, he smacked young Pear on the cheek and grinned when young Pear cried, "Ow!" "Good move, Fennec," Perrin called from under the bush. "Attack your captor. Always fight back." All right. Shem walked through the crowd of men and boys holding pine cones they were itching to throw. A few took shots at young Pear's unshielded legs. "Enough now," Shem said loudly, keeping his volume to just this side of a yell. "We're here on a mission of peace, not war. Remember? All cones down." A variety of groans and disappointed complaining accompanied the dropping of the weapons. "This is not a fair fight," Shem said, walking among them, patting their shirts and trousers pockets to find stowed cones that he pulled out and dropped on the ground. "First, we set up camp." He pointed to the 3 men designated to set up the shelters for the younger boys. "And get dinner ready." He pointed at 4 more who were in charge of setting up the evening meal and fishing for trout. "And gather enough firewood for the night." He pointed to several boys. "And then you may choose sides for teams and engage in a fair and even tossing of pine cones gently at each other. Understood?" The boys offered up mischievously cautious smiles to the stern guide. "Remember," Shem said, All of you promised your mothers you'd behave yourselves." The pine cone that smacked Shem squarely in the chest seemed to fly out of nowhere. A variety of snorts and guffaws accompanied it. Shem looked around and glared. "All right, who threw that?" "My guess would be someone," said Peto, who had just arrived with little Corey and Weshafati, "who didn't promise his mother he'd behave himself." Dek held up his empty hands in innocence. "Perrin!" Shem bellowed. Everyone began to laugh. "Where are you?" Another pine cone sailed but narrowly missed its target, only because Shem dodged out of the way. "Still have some quick reflexes, Sergeant Major. Good to see." Shem peered at the thick shrub where the voice came from. "Remember, General, I know where you're sleeping tonight." As the family laughed, Shem sauntered over to the shrubs. "Get out of there, Perrin, so we can do some fishing." Perrin chuckled. "Gladly. I might need some help, though. My back is, a little stiff." "Serves you right." Shem rubbed his chest where the pine cone hit him. Several of the younger children giggled and ran over to see where Pugga was hiding, and Cephas and Boscos came over to lend a hand. "How did you get in there anyway?" Shem asked. Perrin grunted as he started to back out. "I dove under here when the attack began. Then I realized that if I crawled forward a few paces, I had a clear shot with the pine cones that fell in here. But then you went and called for a truce and ruined all the fun." Shem chuckled as Perrin's boots began to emerge. "Just when I thought you were finally ready to be a grown-up." "Pugga, do you want us to help pull you out?" Cephas asked. "Not yet. I'm caught on something. Hold on. Let me just... Oh!" he cried out. And then Perrin thought, "Oh, so this is how it will go." Young Pear put Fennec down when he heard his grandfather cry out and smirked. "About time someone else got hurt around here." Cephas and Shem, by the bush, were laughing at it, along with the smaller boys who had run over there. "Pugga's stuck!" called a little voice. Young Pear rubbed his hands in anticipation and ambled over. "I can get the hatchet, Father," Peto suggested with a grin as he came over to peer into the bush. "I sharpened it right before the trip, just in case." But Boscos narrowed his eyes. "All right, Uncle Perrin?" "Actually, no," came his voice, sounding strained. "Something's stabbing me in my thigh. I can't get it out." Bosco squatted to look into the bush. "Is it puncturing your flesh?" "Yes," his voice came urgently. "I need help." The smiles fell from the men's faces. General Shin wasn't known to ever plead for assistance. Young Pear's eyebrows rose, and Peto ran to get the hatchet from the pack horse. "Pugga," Cephas said, now down on his hands and knees. "I see the branch." "Where?" Boscos asked, leaning over. "Ah, I see it too. Papa, pull back that bush right in front of you." Shem yanked, and in his growing worry, pulled out half the bush from the ground. Perrin cried out in pain. "Perrin, I'm sorry," Shem said, panicked. No, he mumbled from under the leaves. "You didn't do it. I tried to pull my leg out, and instead my arm got caught in some pokey things." He chuckled weakly. "I think I know how Young Pear feels some days." Young Pear scoffed at that. "Not enough bruising yet, Pugga. You'll need to fall off a short cliff before you know how I feel." Shem evaluated the fragments of the bush he tore from the ground. "I don't see any thorns or prickles on this." "Well, there's something tangled in here with something sharp growing on it," Perrin insisted. "Out of the way," Peto called as he made his way through the crowd of men and boys now clustering around the bush. "Shem, what's the best place to cut?" Dek, analyzing the bush from the opposite side, indicated to a point near Shem. "If you can cut that part first, you'll have a better view of the stick that's impaling Old Pear. Perrin." Over the scattered chuckling, Dek added, "Sorry, Perrin." "No, you're not, Deckett," said the bush feebly. Peto went over next to Shem, saw his father's face through the leaves, and waved to him. "We'll get you out of there soon." Peto carefully hacked at the bush, and after 3 whacks the men could pull a large section of it free. Peto moved in closer, and with a few more carefully placed hits, another segment of the bush was removed, almost completely exposing Perrin. The jagged stick embedded in his leg appeared to be the branch of a coarse vine, an inch in diameter. His light-colored trousers around the stick had turned red with blood, and the stain was growing. Several of the boys stepped back quickly, ew-ing when they saw the injury. Cambo Brighter and Lexinus herded the younger boys over to Bubba Brighter, who had already taken Bosco's son Tolly away from the action to gather pine cones. Sam and Con Cadby quickly joined them with their sons, Encio and Corey, and a few more boys with weaker stomachs followed. Peto squatted by his father. "Yep, that's not the friendliest stick I've ever seen, but we'll get you free of it." He pulled out his knife and started to cut at the thick vine that was rooted to the ground. "Stop! Stop!" young Pear cried out, as Perrin flinched. "You're wiggling the stick in his leg when you do that, Papa. Here." He stepped over next to his father. "Let me hold the stick still so it doesn't aggravate the wound, then start cutting." Perrin patted young Pear's hand gratefully as young Pear wrapped his hands around the stick, just above where it entered Perrin's thigh. Bosco smiled. "Good observation. Want to be my apprentice?" Young Pear shook his head. "Not observation, just experience." Perrin kept his hand over young Pear's as he tightened his grip on the stick. "Cut right there, Papa." Young Pear nodded to a point higher. "Ready?" Peto asked. Both young Pear and Perrin nodded. With quick cuts, Peto severed the stick several inches above young Pear's hand. The remaining boys erupted in cheers. Bosco snatched up his bag and pointed to a flat area. "Get him over to the sandy section. Atlee, find Pugga a blanket to sit on." Barnos, Shin, and Halling Brighter reached down to help up Perrin. No, I can do it," he said, trying to stand up. But he winced in pain, and his grandsons caught each of his arms to pull him up. "Let them help you, Uncle Perrin," Bosco said. "No need to put more pressure on the leg than necessary." Barnos and Halling brought a hobbling Perrin over to where Atlee Brighter had laid out the blanket, and they gently put him down. Perrin moaned as he lay. "I thought Shem assigned some people to start dinner and get camp established. I really don't need an audience." "I'll take care of it," Dex said, not eager to watch what was about to come. He pointed to several of the boys and reissued orders. Soon most of Perrin's audience was gone, but they still tried to peek over to see what was happening. Only Peto, Shem, and young Pear remained to watch Boscos work. As Boscos kneeled by his bag, Shem kneeled by Perrin's head. "It's not that bad," Perrin said, reaching for Shem's arm. "You don't need to ask for a blessing." Shem raised an eyebrow at him. "The Creator has plenty to give out. It's not as if we're bothering him. This is what he's waiting for, to bless us." Boscos looked expectantly at Perrin. "I work best when it's not just me working. The Creator is the real healer. I just get to take the credit." Perrin nodded. "Fine, Shem. Keep it short. He's a busy being." Shem chuckled and closed his eyes. "Dear Creator, will you please help my son to help my brother to complete your work? Amen." Shem opened his eyes and looked at Perrin for approval. Perrin nodded. "See? Doesn't have to be long." Boscos chuckled and pulled out supplies from his bag, observing the remaining stick jutting out from Perrin's thigh, and he said, "Exactly how did you do that, Uncle Perrin? You couldn't have exerted a lot of force, yet that stick seems to be in rather deep." "I don't know," Perrin groaned resignedly. "I felt something pricking my leg, but I just thought it would give way if I pushed past it." Boscos peered at it. "An impact like that suggests someone fell on it from a substantial height. Perhaps it's very sharp." "Just get it out, and you can stare at it all you want, boss," Shem said nervously. Young Pear glanced at Uncle Shem, who was chewing on a fingernail. "King of Salem." Young Pear couldn't see it. I will, Papa, Boscos assured Shem. I'm just waiting for Zadok to bring me a jug of water. See, there he is. Uncle Perrin, I need to cut the trousers to get to it. Fine, boss, he said, flopping an arm over his eyes. I've got extra in my pack. As Boscos trimmed the cloth away with a small pair of scissors, young Pear folded his arms. Kind of strange being on this side of the action. I'm usually on the ground or just waking up in the middle of something or a few hours later. I never get this view. Peto shot him a look. I'm glad I can entertain you, young Pear, said Perrin. Isn't there something you should be doing? Young Pear shook his head. Nope, not on firewood or food or camp detail until tomorrow. I'm still resting, if you recall your orders. Peto gave young Pear another sharp look. Young Pear held his hands up in apology. Boscos eyed the exposed stick. I think I can get it out without cutting any more flesh. Good thing I brought the large bottle of numbing agent. He rummaged around his bag and pulled out a brown bottle. Love that stuff, young Pear nodded in approval. No, Perrin said firmly. I don't want it. Just yank it out, boss. Uncle Perrin, you're being unreasonable, Bosco said. All it does is numb the area around the wound. I just dab it around, wait a few minutes, and... Shem, said Perrin forcefully, explain to your son I do not want it. Shem sent a long-suffering look to his son. Boscos exhaled in frustration. Fine, Uncle Perrin. Papa, go get a plank and beat him. Hey, Perrin said, trying to sit up. It's not that bad. Boscos gave him a cutting glare. Think not? We'll see how you feel in a couple of minutes. This may not just yank out, Uncle Perrin. There are a couple of barbs near the base. If there are more in your flesh, I may have to work it out, and that will not be pleasant. Do you really want your great-grandsons hearing you in pain? Or are you going to think about their needs and allow me to give you enough local sedation to numb it just enough to allow you to deal effectively with the pain you will still feel? This isn't the army, Uncle Perrin. This is a family outing with little boys who have long memories. Shem raised his eyebrows at his son's audacity and sent him a smile of admiration. He shifted his gaze to Perrin. Perrin sighed, nodded briefly to Boscos, and lay back down. Shem grinned at his son. Not many men could force General Shin to see their way. Boscos took the jug of water and poured some over the wound. Perrin writhed in unexpected agony. I thought you were going to numb it. Young Pear sniggered while Boscos smiled slyly. First, I have to cleanse the area. Wasn't pleasant, was it? But it'll be much better in a few minutes, he promised. He dabbed the brown substance on the flesh around the entry point to the stick. Can't you give him some of the green stuff? Peto asked, a permanent wince on his face. My other favorite bottle, young Pear commented. Pain tea. Wouldn't help much at this point, Boscos told him. The pain tea works mostly on internal injuries. I'll give him some later, though, to help relax him. Who came up with that name anyway? Young Pear asked. Sounds like it gives you pain, not takes it away. Boscos chuckled. We brew it when someone is in pain. I don't know who named it 100 years ago, but the name stuck. Don't want it anyway, Perrin grumbled. Young Pear squatted next to Boscos as he inspected the wound. Think it will need stitching, or will resin hold it? Boscos turned to his cousin. What do you think? Young Pear tipped his head in consideration. If it's a straight slice, the resin works fine. But if it's jagged, or there's too much hole to cover, you're best doing stitches. Boscos smiled. Sure you don't want to study medicine? It's too much stuff to memorize. I'm not good at remembering all the different ailments and herbs and formulas. It's hard for everyone, Young Pear, but there are ways to memorize it all. We work together to help each other succeed. Seriously, if you... Shem cleared his throat loudly. Perhaps you could discuss this at another time? Boscos looked up at his father. I'm just waiting for the numbing agent to work, Papa. Actually, young Pear said, it works pretty fast. The more wounded flesh that's exposed, the faster it absorbs into the exposed nerves. I never felt the need for waiting a full 5 minutes. Really? Interesting, Bosco said. Uncle Perrin, how does it feel? I'm trying not to think about it, Perrin answered, his arm over his eyes again. Bosco's poked the flesh around the stick. Perrin didn't flinch. Bosco's nodded at young Pear, who smiled smugly in a "I told you so" manner. All right, Uncle Perrin, some patients like me to tell them everything I'm doing. Others just want me to work without knowing what's going on. What kind of patient are you? Not a very patient one, Bosco's. Just get it out and don't waste time talking. As you wish. And he started to pull experimentally on the stick. The barbs did go beneath the flesh, and he silently pointed out that fact to young Pear, who was watching closely, but also kept an eye on his father and uncle. Peto had that frown on his face which always meant he was growing nauseated, and turned away for a moment to exchange a quick, shuddering look with Dick. Perrin winced in discomfort at the tugging of Bosco's, but the pain didn't seem too bad. Shem's eyes darted anxiously from Perrin to his son's efforts and back again. Peto reached over and patted Shem on the shoulder, and he jumped in surprise. It'll be all right, Peto whispered. Father's in excellent hands. Shem smiled briefly at Peto's assessment and went back to watching his son Bosco's slowly twist and pull on the stick. Young Pear noticed something. Right there, boss, he said as he huddled next to his cousin. Another barb catching on that ragged edge? Yes, very good. Perhaps a twist in this direction? Yes, now another barb. Twist the opposite direction. That's it, boss, you've got it. Now twist in the other direction again. That's one nasty stick. Perrin shifted uncomfortably, trying not to listen to them. One more twist, boss. I see it. Those have got to be the most unusual barbs I've ever seen. Go in easily, but refuse to come back out. I'm saving this stick to show Dr. Toon. Uncle Peto, ever seen such a vine before in your studies? I specialized in trees and terrain, Peto said, his voice a touch shaky. Not pokey things. I never realized thorns could be such a menace, Bosco said, sliding the bloodied stick out a little more and twisting again. Young Pear rocked back on his heels, thinking about thorns and menace. Here it was, many years later and many miles from Edge, Perrin Shin was still being tormented by thorns. The whole idea sat strangely on young Pear, like a complex puzzle he wanted to solve, but was almost too frightened to approach. Almost. Peto glanced over at him, trying to figure out why his son reacted so unusually. Young Pear didn't meet his gaze. And it's out, Boscos announced, holding up the red-stained evidence. Congratulations, Uncle Perrin. You've produced a bloody, thorny stick. The tip is just what I suspected, pointed and sharp, perfectly angled to penetrate. Must have gone in about 2 inches. Well done pushing right past that. Perrin sighed in relief. Oh, I have to admit, Boscos, that ointment actually helped. Good job. Bosco smiled as Perrin moved his arm from his eyes. I'm not yet finished, though. We need to close the wound. It's split open in a jagged way. Young Pear was right. It's going to need a few stitches. Perrin nodded and put his arm back over his eyes. Just do it, boss. Bosco studied the wound first. At least it's not bleeding much, Shem offered. I rather wished it did, Papa. Boscos examined the stick he removed. Uncle Perrin's not the first to get caught on this. Right here, animal hairs on the barbs. And this speck of dirt, see it? And right there, this looks like a little bit of moss. Shem crouched and peered at the dirty stick. So this means... Bleeding would purge the wound of any of these objects still in his leg. But if any of it is still in him and I stitch it closed... Peto held his hand over his mouth. His stamina for the situation was beginning to weaken. "What do you recommend?" "I need to wash it out some more since it won't bleed sufficiently. And then, Uncle Perrin, after I stitch it, I hate to say it, I'm going to have to mold you." "Oh, you can't be serious," Perrin scoffed. Peto began to chuckle. "Father, I don't know why you're so opposed to that." Perrin tried to sit up again. "Because it's so ridiculous." But Boscos was already at work, pouring more water over the open wound in an effort to dislodge any dirt that might have remained. "We've been bread molding people for over 130 years. Just because no one in the world you came from understands it. It really works, Uncle Perrin. Yes, it seems odd, but somehow it sucks out the infection." Young Pear smiled. "And if you get hungry, Pugga, you always know where you can get a bite to eat." "Don't eat it," Bosco said, alarmed, opening the bottle of numbing agent again. "It could kill you." Perrin shook his head in dismay. "See, that's what I don't understand. Tell me how a moldy piece of bread that can kill you if you eat it will cure you if you strap it to your wound." "I wish I could tell you, Uncle Perrin," Bosco said, again dabbing the brown liquid around the jagged puncture. "But we're not sure ourselves. It just often works, that's all we know." Perrin lay back down. "It will take weeks to mold some bread. Your mother just baked it yesterday." Bosco smiled. "But we've been molding several pieces for a few weeks in preparation for this trip." "You would," Perrin chuckled weakly. "I actually thought I'd be using it on young Pear, not old Pear," said Boscos, as he pulled out a needle and thread wrapped in clean white cotton. "Noria was wondering why I wanted so much cultivated." "You must be the only man who's happy when his wife's cooking goes moldy," Perrin murmured. "She makes it moldy for me. She's a skilled chemist." Shem watched as Bosco squeezed Perrin's thigh, trying to get it bleed. "Don't understand it," he said. "Perrin was always a great bleeder." "Thanks a lot, Shem," Perrin mumbled. "It's the nature of the wound, Papa," Boscos explained. "Splits like this don't often gush." Peto was beginning to look clammy, and young Pear was sure he'd be on the ground in a few minutes. Medical talk wasn't his thing. It was always his mother who sat next to young Pear, holding his hand when the doctor stitched him up or set his broken bones. Mama had a much stronger constitution for these things than Papa, who usually sat outside of the room waiting anxiously. Young Pear still remembered when, 4 years ago, Boscos had come over excitedly to tell them all he'd passed the entrance exam to study medicine. Peto had made the mistake of telling him that back in Edge he considered becoming a doctor, for about 10 minutes. Lilla had laughed and laughed about that, much to Peto's chagrin. "Seriously, you considered being a doctor when I gave birth to all of you?" Lilla announced to their family, as her husband hid behind his hand in consternation. "Your father stayed in bed longer than I did because he was so woozy from watching me deliver his children." Papa had never been able to live that one down. Young Pear smirked at his father's graying complexion, then turned to his uncle. "So tell me, Uncle Shem, what kind of a bleeder was Pugga?" With enough details, Peto would be vomiting in the shrubs behind him within minutes. Shem smiled, oblivious to young Pear's plotting to see his father become sick. "There were many slices and nicks over the years, some in practice, a few in action. Your Pugga was planked at least half a dozen times to stitch those up. Now, I wasn't there yet to witness the gash the garters gave him on his back, but the jagged scar is still there. But I think the best incident was years ago when he was training the cook." Perrin groaned, and not because Boscos was dabbing more numbing agent on the edges of his gash. Peto sat down on a log, looking dizzy. He held his head in his hands and asked, "The cook? I don't know that I remember that." Shem chuckled. "He wasn't the cook at the time, and you were only a few years old, Peto. He wanted to be a soldier, but he was the clumsiest thing I'd ever seen." Bosco's readied a needle and thick thread. Young Pear pointed at something on Perrin's leg, and Boscos nodded. It wasn't so much that he was clumsy. Perrin winced briefly as Boscos began to tug on his skin, but that he was weak. One of the skinniest things we had ever come in. He barely passed the physical. He didn't have enough arm strength to steady the sword. I tried, Perrin, Shem said. I worked him and fattened him up, but no muscle ever developed on his spindly little arms. So what happened? Young Pear asked, watching Peto sway slowly back and forth. Perrin squeezed his eyes shut briefly as Bosco started another stitch. I decided to train him one-on-one with the sword, Perrin said, slightly breathless. Spent an hour with him every afternoon. After 2 weeks, I thought he might be ready for a little practice and sparring. He ended with a cringe as Boscos tugged. Good thing there were witnesses, Shem said, frowning at the stitching, or no one would have believed it was an accident. I saw it. Perrin couldn't have been easier on him, but the poor boy tried to lunge, tripped over his own feet, and the weight of the sword literally tipped him over. Perrin tried to catch him and got tangled up with him as well. Next thing we know, Perrin's flat on the ground with the soldier's sword sticking out of his side. The poor boy was terrified and started crying, I've killed Major Shin! Shem chuckled at the memory. He never touched a sword again, if I recall correctly. Kept to the kitchens after that. I think I remember that now, Peto said, lifting his head. While his color was still off, Young Pear figured he was probably past being sick, since he wasn't watching the stitching. Maybe next time. Weren't you in bed for a long time, Father? Peto asked. Yes, Perrin winced again. Sword went right into my liver. That would cause a lot of bleeding, Boscos agreed. He nodded to Young Pear in a conspiring manner and presented him the needle. Young Pear burst into a grin and knew exactly what to do. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Peto's mouth drop open in alarm, and Young Pear slid the needle into the ragged flesh. Perrin didn't even flinch as he mumbled, Even the slash on my back wasn't as bad as that sword to my side. Yes, you've taken a lot of hits over the years, Shem said, not realizing who of the 2 young men hovering over Perrin's thigh was actually working on it. And you've had plenty of stitches, too, but that one was the worst. I had to hide your undershirt so Mari wouldn't see how much blood you'd lost. She was quite upset when she arrived at the fort and saw your condition. How long were you down? Boscos asked, nodding in approval to Young Pear and motioning for him to do the next stitch. It really was quite simple, nothing to it, just pulling torn flesh together. About a week, Perrin said, oblivious, his eyes shut tightly. Boss, your father stayed at our house to help take care of me. He even postponed his leave home just so he could stay and help Mari. He was about your age at the time. Maybe that's where you get your doctoring talent. Boscos winked at his cousin, who completed another stitch and chuckled quietly. Shem noticed and recoiled in dismay when he realized it was Young Pear expertly stitching Perrin under Boscos's guidance. Peto was covering his face with both hands, unable to watch. I never had the inclination for doctoring, Perrin, Shem said, wincing in worry. I just knew there was no way Mari was going to tolerate you staying at the fort for a week, and there was also no way she'd be able to move you on her own. You were in agony for several days. I remember, and I don't know if I ever thanked you enough. Trust me, you did. It was my pleasure to help, but it was hard to watch. You were so miserable. You don't know how tempted I was to bring you some pain tea, but neither the scouts nor I could come up with a convincing story as to where we got it. We couldn't even slip it into your food or water because it has such a distinctive taste. The one thing I don't love about it, Young Pear said, as he knotted the stitch he completed. Shem said in a faraway tone, I don't know why I didn't realize he would be in a lot of pain as well. Who? Perrin asked. Shem scratched his chin. I don't know why I just thought of him, but Lemuel, after the offensive, even though his internal organs weren't hit, he did have 30 stitches. Boscos let out a low whistle. Whew, a soldier? Where were his stitches? Along the base of his ribs. Shem gestured on himself. Ouch, Boscos said, pointing to young Pear where the last stitch should go. Shem rubbed his chin guiltily. I wasn't exactly nice to him. He wasn't a favorite of mine. He was leaning up against me after his procedure, and I purposely let him fall to the ground. Boscos looked up at his father, whom he'd only ever known as a gentle, kind man. Really? That's so unlike you. Perrin, his eyes still squeezed shut, chuckled softly. 2 things you don't understand, Boscos. First, your father was a great soldier and an effective leader. Coming to Salem made him lose the first attribute, but intensified the second. The other thing you don't understand is that Lemuel Thorne should have died in Moreland. Young Pear jerked at the name of Thorne. His grandfather flinched at young Pear's clumsiness. Boscos took over the needle and finished the stitch. I don't know about that, Perrin, Shem said quietly as Boscos clipped the thread. And if he'd been paying attention to his attacker instead of watching me take out the garter behind him, he wouldn't have been injured either, Perrin declared. Thorne was foolish and reckless, and it was up to me to preserve him. Young Pear listened intently. True, but we had him under enough control, Perrin, Shem said, not convincingly, though. Occasionally I wonder if I'd been better to him, befriended him. Perrin opened his eyes and tried to sit up, but immediately thought twice about it. Shem, I don't know of any man who tried harder than you. He wasn't interested in being our friend. He was interested in taking over our fort. He was manipulative and wholly out of line in many, many ways, he said darkly. I don't know how much more of a friend you could have been by not killing him when you had the right and opportunity to do it. Boscos, young Pear, and Peto stared at Shem. Lek, who was passing by, stopped in his tracks and turned to his father. Shem grew uncomfortable under their stares. Now's not the time, Perrin, he murmured. He nodded to his oldest son in a manner that meant, move along and don't ever ask about this again. Lek obediently walked off, likely because he knew his brother Boscos wouldn't let the matter drop so easily. So, Boscos said casually, rummaging around in his bag, this sounds like an interesting bit of history we've never been privy to. He pulled out some bandages and another wrapped package. I think it's a very appropriate time, Papa. You could have killed a man and didn't. Sounds like it would be a great story for the congregations to hear about self-mastery and shunning the ways of the world. He unwrapped part of a package and held up a piece of bread covered in various shades of green. Young Pear, anxious to hear of Shem's experience with Thorne, nevertheless sneered in appreciation at the moldy bread. Not everything in history is necessary to remember, son, Shem said through clenched teeth. But Peto was watching Shem earnestly. Did it have something to do with Jadesy? He whispered. Shem's eyes flared in fury. Boscos, placing the bread on the wound, paused and saw the unexpected look in his father's eyes. Young Pear noticed that just as quickly as it rose, the anger faded. He couldn't remember ever seeing Uncle Shem livid before. Yes, he said with such finality that they knew Shem wasn't going to say anything more about it. Boscos and young Pear exchanged intrigued looks before Boscos unwrapped a long bandage and worked the end under Perrin's leg. Shem, Perrin said, even if you had made more progress with him, it's not as if any of that would have mattered after we left. Peto nodded in agreement, and Shem shrugged. Boscos finished wrapping. Uncle Perrin, how does it feel? What, you're done? Boscos grinned. Completely. Stitched and molded. You're ready for anything, except for hiking and long walks. You need to stay off that leg for a couple of days. Fortunately, I brought a sling that we can rig onto the 2 horses. No, absolutely not. Perrin pushed himself upright. I am not going to be carried. Bascos, wiping his hands on a cloth, wasn't about to back down. Look, your grandson and I just put in 7 stitches. Perrin's eyebrows shot up. You let young Pear stitch me? He's a natural. Did an excellent job. Young Pear beamed smugly and wiped off his hands, too. Uncle Perrin, if you go walking around on that, you'll tear them all out, and we'll have to put in 7 more. I might even let some of your other grandchildren have a stab at it. Perrin studied his nephew. You would have been a good fort surgeon. Flattery will get you nowhere, Uncle Perrin, said Bascos dismissively. You really need to rest that leg. I'm fairly confident the wound is clean, but there's no sense in aggravating it. You could ride one of the horses if you prefer. Take turns holding the little boys. I know they love riding with you. You could tell them all kinds of stories instead of racing up the trail. Now, tonight, we will move you to the fire and you will stay there. Understood? He put his hands on his waist. If you need anything, we'll bring it to you, right? Yes, Dr. Zenas. But Perrin's smile had undertones of rebellion. Tomorrow morning I'll take a look at it. Maybe we can take the mold off then. In the meantime, don't disturb it. Whatever you say. Bosco stood up and announced to the family, He's stitched up. Now, nobody bother him or jump on his leg or trip over him or challenge him to a race. Understand? A variety of yeses and laughs acknowledged his warning. Ralph Shin and Cephas Brighter walked over to help Perrin. We already prepared a spot by the fire, Pugga. You should be comfortable there for the night. How's it feel? Cephas asked. It stings, but I'll survive, he said as he sat down where some logs had been set up as a seat and support. Thank you, boys. The real pain will come when we get home. I promised your Mugga I'd be careful. How am I going to explain this to her? And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you.